Hello writers, I am Sab John Idathatil, professional screenwriter and your personal story coach. I am here to describe and explain something that we generally term as adaptation. Adaptation in life and other conditions of life may vary, but what we are going to discuss here is about adapting to film or movies. Usually this adaptation or something which is altered or amended text is what we consider here, which is converted for the use and entertainment of movies is what we are going to discuss. Adaptation existed right from the times of cinema itself. Even before that, adaptations had its own journeys in many different ways. For example, we should talk about Shakespearean plays. We consider Shakespearean play as original, but it's not original. Most of the plays that Shakespeare had written was influenced by historical events which really happened, or rather probably with the chronicles written by one Raphael Holinshed. Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland and Ireland. This book had immensely influenced Shakespeare in developing most of his plays. And he also was influenced by many other tales during those times. Romeo and Juliet was something which was influenced from a tale from Italy by an author with the very same name, Shakespeare. At the same time, Hamlet was influenced by a Scandinavian tale. That's why adaptation needs a lot of comparative and studies by itself. ഞാൻ മലയാളത്തിൽ രണ്ട് വാക്ക് പറയാം ഇവിടെ. ഈ അഡാപ്റ്റേഷൻ എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഒരു അനുരൂപീകരണമാണ്. അത് നമ്മൾ ചിലപ്പോൾ അതിനെ രൂപാന്തരപ്പെടുത്തുക എന്ന് പറയാം, ചിലപ്പോൾ നമ്മളതിനെ വ്യതിയാനപ്പെടുത്തുക എന്ന് പറയാം, ഭേദഗതി ചെയ്യുക എന്ന് പറയാം. ഇതെല്ലാം അഡാപ്റ്റേഷൻ്റെ ഭാഗമായിട്ട് നമ്മൾ കാണേണ്ടതാണ്. At the same time, in present contemporary times, the theories of adaptation also is changing. Why? Because there are many different levels of platforms where you find these platforms are genuinely connected with movie itself. So once the internet came into being, the concept of cinema also has changed. There are many platforms which exist or coexist for an adaptation. So an adaptation to a television and an adaptation to a movie or adaptation to a game, all these conditions start existing. So the definition of adaptation is something more of a biological definition than a definition which was placed on a dichotomy of text to movies. So the definition of an altered or amended text will pave way for a more accurate definition in contemporary storytelling and contemporary times of conversion, as it is more biological. This biological definition means a product or an organism or a species, once it gets altered to conditions in which, or the environs in which it is placed and it has to sustain. This is one definition of adaptation these days. For example, I'll tell you that if there is a snake, for example, when you see a python in a forest, it will have its own tendency to change its color so that for the sake of existing and sustaining in that environment, it may have certain differences with a python that you see in a desert. So this is exactly what we are trying to compare, even with tales and texts that's converted to the many different varied platforms of movie itself, which you generally call a digital movie these days. There is another way to define adaptations through. This adaptation doesn't happen just to an organism or a particular species in one go. This organism changes through over and over many generations of change, and then it happens to a final product for a certain environment. So these are the two things that contemporary conditions of movie making has evolved, and through that adaptations also have evolved. For example, I'll tell you, a television series called Star Trek. Star Trek actually started in the 1960s. Star Trek was first dreamed and dramatized by a fighter pilot called Gene Roddenberry in 1966, where he started off with, he wanted to change his career. After World War II, after being a bomber pilot, he joined the police force. And then again, he shifted his career to writing television. In that stage, he started with something called The Lieutenant. Soon, Lieutenant was stopped, and it was a short-living series. And then he started writing Star Trek. Star Trek survived only for 3 seasons. So in 1967, Star Trek was lifted by NBC, the television channel, because it was not getting the kind of TRP rates that it had to at those times. So what the channel did, there were a lot of fans evolved through that television series over a period of time. Just for the fans, they made another season and then they stopped it. That was the end of that series. It hardly stood for a year or so. And then it evolved as a cluster of many different products. The same thing. Star Trek, because of its great fanfare, there was even fan fictions coming out of it. You know what is a fan fiction? It is about what the fans write with the same characters unauthorizedly, not considering the copyright, just for the heck of changing or interactive stories between the fans. These are all adaptations from one singular product. So Star Trek came in as a great, demanding, popular movie. And it came into I would call it a franchise of movies. After that, it came in as a game. It again came back as a television series later. So it became a cluster of products which were very popular, and still Star Trek remains an untouched brand by itself in many platforms. But the success story of Star Trek may not be there as a success story for X-Files. X-Files also was a kind of television series, very popular, but they tried a movie franchise which failed. So this change of environment with a particular product and converting it to suit an environment may or may not be successful. So in that case, we need to arrange the adaptation or foresee or envision an adaptation to a condition where it is suited to a certain environment. At the same time, it has to draw the applause, recognition, and connectivity with the emerging audience or evolving audience. So these are the general things that I want to tell as a premise to adaptations in world cinema. Then we'll go to the next stage of what are the parameters in which we can look at adaptations in world cinema. See, much like the biological organism, the field of adaptation theory is also constantly evolving in response to changes in its environment. So how do adaptations change because there is a change in the platform or the environment? For example, let us consider a novel called Born Identity. Born Identity was a novel, I think if I remember right, it was published in 1975. During those times, there were no mobile phones. And then in 1976 or 77, this movie was made based on this novel. It was adapted without the character having a mobile phone. Now, look at the various other adaptations that pursued after the mobile phone concept or mobile phone came into being, became part of a common man's life. Then the character also had to change. The adaptation had to go through varying changes because the environment changed. So this is a very crucial point with adaptations. Sometimes with certain novels you want to portray as it is, that is a choice which is taken by a movie maker or the character, but at the same time it will look a little aloof from what changes the environment has by itself gone through. Whatever be the adaptation, it has to have an intended result. So if the intended result is according to a change in the environment, yes. If the intended result is just to popularize a certain thing, well, that's another kind of adaptation. In sometimes from the written text, You just consider only the mood or the periphery of the entire text, not the internal placements of characters or the world itself. We just take the periphery of that text. Let us now discuss about what can be the best process, or is there a process best to adapt a literary material to a movie of its special environment. Now, I am just giving you an example here of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. This was literally a short story, The Sentinel, and he bought the copyrights of this short story, which is a science fiction story. Both Kubrick and Clarke had made a kind of a consensus that from this story, they are going to build a screenplay and a novel together. So let us make the decision, analyze the decision here. They never jumped from expanding the story or expanding the story from the short story level immediately to a screenplay. But at the same time, Clarke wanted to pursue the concept of a novel, expanding it to a novel, as Stanley Kubrick wanted to pursue expanding it to a screenplay simultaneously. This was a great exercise for both of them.
St. Mary's Central School, Rajakumari, Mangatoti, a dream project of the Diocese of Idukki, is an educational institution that inspires students to set their ambitions high.
Though there were disparities or differences at the initial stages, what they did was they made a 50,000 word prose thing. This is what Kubrick calls it, a prose thing on The Sentinel first. From there, they were trying to work more towards a novel on one side and a screenplay on the other side. So as they make these exercises together and simultaneously, they could have an interactive process in between with an outlook of a novel from Clarke's side and from an absolutely visual-oriented screenplay from Stanley Kubrick on the other side. Though definitely there was an intention from Clarke at some point of time to release the novel earlier than the movie could be made, but it was not possible. Finally, he also had to revise his novel text from certain visual orientations from the screenplay itself. So this was actually the process. So imagine how good a process was it to adapt. It was very effective, and still the movie remains as one of the best output of its own as 2001 Space Odyssey, and The Sentinel by itself remains as one of the best sci-fi short stories Clarke has ever written. So it each maintains its own realm, at the same time its own happiness and productivity in its own terms, and the result in its own terms to its respective audiences. Let us again take this example of Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. Why should one call it Coppola's Dracula when this was adapted from Bram Stoker's Dracula? There was a process that he had gone through. So he started reading the entire novel sets or the movies that was ever made. They watched it together. The creative team watched all of these one by one together. And as they were reading every line of this novel or the textual format aloud so that everyone can hear it and then take notes of it. So it became, I would say, a creative combination of many minds. And then finally, Coppola arrived on something which is very specific and special. That became Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, and it became an exquisite love story. So this is one change which has happened from the original or the varied different adaptations ever made so far into a love story which was so very specific and original in its own terms, but from the adapted content, from the source, which is not highly tethered. At the same time, the filmmaker had his own freedom to make his product in its own terms original. Suppose, let us say that Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula could ever be extended to a web content now, then it will grow on its own terms. It's another generation in the making. So stories nowadays in the present context have great scope for its own growth with varied forms and branches and types from a certain content which it is originally based on. Now let us come to Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, which was a highly popular film, much acclaimed by critics and viewers together. In 1922, the story was written by Ryanshuke Kurozawa, who was a popular writer of his own terms, and he died premature in 1927. So about 5 years before he died, he wrote this story. So he had written this story about the testimonies of 5 different people about a dead body which was found near a mountain. And 5 different people talk about what they have seen is what that story is. So it is a very, I would call it a very vague type of story where nothing is specifically concluded in that story. It's all about how 5 people say what they have seen. Akira Kurosawa actually had decided to take this as the source of adaptation. But at the same time, he realized that this is not containing, or this is not enough for a movie's length. So what he did, he again found Kurosawa's another story called Rashomon. What Akira Kurosawa did was he joined these 2 stories and put the caption of the second story, Rashomon, as the title. So this is what really is. You should read both these stories and then look at the film. Now, as far as the film is concerned, it has its own identity. First of all, rain is been a great metaphor here about the chaos within the characters' minds and the chaos which was prevalent in that world at that point of time. So it is, and Kurosawa also had in mind to go back to the times when movies were made silent. So he wanted to make with lesser possible dialogue so that he could give more importance and value for the kind of visuals he was making. So the photography was excellent, the sound was excellent, the characters portrayed were all absolutely wonderful. But at the same time, from the cryptic nature of Kurosawa's story, he has made it more pronounced and more revealing, where he added and deleted certain characters' testimony and added the woodcutter's testimony more, so that finally he is seeing what the truth was. So this portion is being added specifically, which is a great detour from what actually the vague ambiguity which was, or the ambiguity prevalent in that story. But the story had its own renowned, unique positioning by being vague or cryptic. But Kurosawa's portrayal of the story and the characters has become exquisitely revealing, satisfying. At the same time, the audio-visual content created a very specific notes of its own, as far as the viewer is concerned, also the critic in a viewer is concerned. So this is what actually the deviation was. Now let us look at how this movie got its popularity, because after having made the film, he had duality. He was even wondering whether I should be taking this story for a movie project at all. At the same time, when he realized that this movie was taken to Venice, got an entry in Venice Film Festival. This was actually with the help of Giuliana Stramigioli, who was the founder of Italia Film in Japan. And she actually happened to see Kurosawa's Rashomon, and she loved the film, and even without Kurosawa knowing about it, she made this entry to Venice Festival, and later on it bagged the best foreign film in the Academy Awards in the US. So this actually is the story. Akira Kurosawa never expected the movie to have this kind of a wide popular appeal or critical appeal as he was making the film. He had his own doubts about the product, the final product, but at the same time he was too very sincere about what he was showing. So basically, another thing that I want to discuss here is Kurosawa's story had a sense of originality because it was coming from his heart. And when Akira Kurosawa had gone through the story, even joined 2 stories together to make another audiovisual story, he too put in something which was an interrogation from within his heart. and make a recreation which is absolutely unique, not like the story, but in its own terms, it carried a great aura of itself. So this is where the true adaptation material comes in. When you have a material you have found, probably as a creator, as a movie maker, or as any movie maker, they should have a definition about what is the true thing that I am getting it from or getting towards from here. So this is something that has to be answered, and that answer you find in Kurosawa's Rashomon. And last but not the least, we should consider every story as a representative of a larger and more divergent creative process where no form of boundary will exist. So with this concept, we should all be able to approach adaptations fairly, not boasting ourselves as great movie adventurists nor literary purists. At this point, I don't want to discuss more because adaptation is too vast an ocean where you can delve deep to any extents. I wish this international film festival called Literature and as Cinema, organized by the English department of Pavanatma College, Murikasheri, all the success in their efforts. And I also wish the participants a very fruitful journey.